For joining us for our final Manure Matters webinar. My name is Sam and I work for Clark Conservation District. I am joined tonight by my co-host Ashley Smithers, who also works for Clark CDE, Terry Coper from WSU Extension's Small Acreage Program, and our main presenters Eric Lambert and Brent Davis from Clark County. We will get to our main presentation soon, but we have some extra informational slides to go through first. Next slide. As a reminder, this is a three-part webinar series focusing on mud and manure, pasture management, and water quality. Tonight is the final installment that will be focusing on water quality. If you missed the first two but would like to watch them, you can find those recordings on our website. Next slide. Clark Conservation District is a non-regulatory agency that works with residents of Clark County by providing technical assistance to encourage good stewardship of our natural resources. We put on several workshops and webinars like this one. To check out some of our past webinars, learn about upcoming webinars, or to sign up for our newsletter, head to our website. Next slide. Poop Smart Clark is a new program that is aiming to reduce poop in our surface waters. Through partnership with various organizations, Clark CD can provide technical and financial assistance to eligible landowners to install best management practices. If you have too much animal poop or are curious if you are eligible for assistance, you can contact me to sign up for a site visit or ask questions. My contact information will be in the chat box and also on our website. Next slide.
Hi, I'm Ashley Smithers, and I'll be working with Sam to conduct mini site visits to help you cover your piles of manure. If you have watched this series, you have learned the importance of covering manure piles, and hopefully this evening you'll learn even more reasons why that's important. During these 15-minute site visits, this is an opportunity to meet with Clark CD staff, cover your manure pile, and learn about additional resources available for you, and hopefully sign up for a longer site visit, and then maybe even see if you're a good candidate to enroll in our Poop Smart Clark program. Next slide. Okay, so feel free to visit our website if you would like to sign up for that mini site visit. It's at the same place that you registered. And if you have any additional questions, contact Sam and myself. Next slide. Next up is Terry Coper from the WSU Small Acreage Program, here to let you know more about the programs and opportunities with WSU.
Good evening, I'm Terry Coper. I'm the Small Acreage Program Coordinator at WSU Clark County Extension. The bulk of our programming is in partnership with the Clark County Public Works Clean Water Program. Next slide. So our mission is to provide small acreage land stewards such as yourselves the knowledge, skills, and resources necessary to manage your land and your animals in ways that help keep the water clean and protect natural resources. Next. So throughout the year, we offer different educational opportunities, different class series and workshops, the Small Acreage Expo, and best management practice tours, small farm tours, and the harvest celebration. Next. Next slide. So we offer well and septic inspection workshops. If you have a gravity fed system and that's at your home, you could get certified to inspect your own system every other time, alternating with a professional. And it's also a great opportunity to just learn how to maintain your well and septic systems. Next slide. We also offer a class series called Living on the Land. If you'd like to learn about land stewardship and how to better manage your land. This starts in September and it's a once a week in the evenings class. You can learn about weed management, pasture management, and soil improvement. Next slide. So, and we have another class series called Ag Entrepreneurship and Business Planning. Whether you're just starting a new business, have an idea that you'd like to develop further, or if you have an existing business, it's good class for you. Throughout the class, you can learn to develop your business plan. You'll be developing a business plan throughout the class, and then just meeting new resources and other folks doing similar endeavors in the county. Next slide. Also in the fall, the third Saturday in September is the harvest celebration. This is when different farms throughout the county show off their produce and show the bounty of Clark County. It's a great place to bring your family and come do a tour, have some fun, buy some produce from your local farmers. Next slide. All right, so if you feel like you're doing a good job with keeping the water clean and you'd like to participate in our recognition program, what it entails is just letting me know, and I can come out and do a site assessment. And if you qualify, you can get one of these nice metal signs. Hang it on your gate and let your neighbors know that you would be a good person to talk to about these things. Next slide. All right, so if you are interested in our educational programs and would like to hear more about, be notified about when they're coming up, you can either send me an email and I'll add you to the small acreage listserv, or it'd be actually good to just put it in the chat this evening and let me know. If you have any questions, my email is terry.coper@wsu.edu. And thanks for having me, Conservation District, and I hope you have a good workshop and a great evening. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Terry. We will now move on from that. Ashley, would you like to share the results from our Who Are You poll? And then we will move on to our main presenter for the evening. For the past decade, Eric Lambert has worked with the Clark County community to protect water quality and stream health. He currently serves as an outreach specialist with Clark County Public Works Clean Water. Before that, he coordinated WSU Extension's small acreage program, which provides education and resources to help land managers reach their goals while protecting natural resources. I also wanted to let folks know that after Eric's presentation, we will have time for a few questions, so please be sure to put those in the Q&A box. With that, I will let you take it away, Eric.
Okay, thanks, Sam. So I'm Eric Lambert with Clark County, and this isn't my title slide, but my title slide suggested that we'll be talking a little bit about some of the things that we've been looking for and finding as we try to address bacteria issues in some of our local streams. Clark County Clean Water Division, Division of Public Works, is tasked with protecting our water quality in our streams and lakes throughout the county. And so we have a team of scientists that monitors our water in a number of different ways. And so we'll just talk a little bit about that, some of the results that we've been finding in the past few years. And then we'll turn it over to Brent to talk about some of the other things for this for tonight. We're going to kind of focus mostly on the animal side of things, of the bacteria issues. And you know, animals are a big part of life in Clark County. A lot of folks do have animals. They can be a really fulfilling part of living on the land. But without proper management, they can definitely pose some risks and cause some issues to our ecosystem, to our environment, to our water quality. Without proper management, some of these big animals can damage riparian areas, the areas beside streams. You know, it can be surprising, you know, an animal like a horse that, you know, weighs about, 1,200 pounds or something. You know, the ground pressure that those hooves can exert on the land can be, surprising, especially when they're walking. That PSI can really climb up there compact the land and you know, damage some sensitive riparian areas pretty quickly. And as of course, the rest of these workshops have covered, the manure issue poses some other concerns with regard to bacteria, but also the nutrients in the runoff, and those are some things that animals can cause if proper management is not implemented. You know, on the other hand, particularly with manure, you know, there's a lot of good things that can be done with manure. You know, composting it properly and spreading it back in the fields at the right time can be a great way to cut fertilizer costs and implement safe fertilizer, and really kind of close that loop in in your farm management. And I think you've already talked a bit about management, so we'll just move along now and cover some more of these things. This is just an example of, you know, some of these animals that can have, but particularly the bigger animals, but even small animals too, some of the impacts and some of the effects of letting animals just have unlimited access to our waterways. You see a lot of erosion. You can see increased sediment getting into the streams. The manure, obviously, there's a place for it to enter the streams that way, and our riparian areas really play a big role. They serve a lot of functions to help filter out nutrients, to stabilize banks, to provide wildlife habitat, and so they're really that's part of the reason why they're so important to protect. And then, of course, you know, we've got two examples here: the uncovered pile up top, close to some puddles. I always think of water as kind of being like nature's ultimate transporter. It just moves stuff around, and so you know, maybe this isn't necessarily right next to the stream, but there's a puddle there. You know, where's that going to run off? Eventually, it will likely reach the stream, and that's how a lot of these pollutants are introduced. This example down below, you know, covered with a tarp, covered with a roof, does a great job of preventing a lot of the negative impacts from manure, but also can help with composting. So I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about a case study. We do our monitoring team of natural resource specialists do a lot of monitoring in, you know, all of our streams, but recently, since 2017, we've been doing especially a lot of monitoring and work in the East Fork Lewis River. And maybe you've heard of the East Fork Lewis River Partnership. And part of the reasons why this was, you know, we wanted to do this was, you know, the East Fork Lewis River is a high priority salmon bearing watershed. It also faces high development pressure. There's lots of agriculture. There's a lot of homes use on-site sewage. And so in 2017, the Department of Ecology started this kind of alternative plan for a TMDL, which is a total maximum daily load acronym. Basically, if you have water bodies that are impaired, then they will issue this TMDL based on what the impairment is. In the case of the East Fork Lewis River, that watershed, including the main stem and also many of the tributaries, were impaired both with bacteria, but also temperature. I'm not going to cover temperature so much today, but in short, because it is salmon bearing and salmon are sensitive to temperatures, they need that cool, clean water. When the temperature in these streams starts to increase, oftentimes due to shade being removed along streams, then that can be considered a pollutant in the eyes of the Department of Ecology. But we'll focus on bacteria here, and you can see this is the East Fork Lewis River and some of the tributaries. Kind of closer up to the center, you have that first tributary heading up north is Jones Creek. The next one heading south is McCormick Creek. And we'll talk about some of the other priority ones there. But the reason why that that, this is listed here as a 303D list, which is Washington State's polluted waters list. And what that really means is that these water bodies when they're shaded in that either orange, red, or yellow, means that those water bodies were found not to meet state water quality standards. The state water quality standards for bacteria is measured with E. coli, also fecal coliform. It recently changed to E. coli in 2019. But they're looking at basically, you can't have levels that exceed 100 colony forming units per 100 milliliters of water. And you can't have more than 10% of the samples that exceed 320 colony forming units per 100 milliliters of water, or 200 colony forming units for 100 milliliters of water for fecal coliform. And so ecology noticed, and we noticed that that there is some problems and some issues in this high priority watershed. And so, that's only a part of the story. When ecology started leading this project, there's lots of partners that we brought in here. Partners that include the Conservation District, public health, the WSU Extension Small Acreage Program, the Watershed Alliance. It really takes a team effort to take these watershed type approaches. And this is kind of the way that their process goes. They start with the water quality monitoring and data collection. It's important to know what you're looking at and find out, what are potentially some of the causes. So then they look at the source assessment. So when they start to look a little bit more closely at land use and try to pinpoint where some of these problems might be coming from, because sometimes, and this was the case in a couple different instances in the East Fork already, it was a landowner that was close to a tributary to the East Fork Lewis River that in some cases, maybe we're kind of unaware that they were contributing to some of this bacteria by some of their manure management practices, and voluntarily, cleaned up their practice, which has made some improvements. After the source assessment, ecology develops a water cleanup plan, which I think they're in the midst of finalizing right around now. I think there's a draft out right now. But again, they look at the different water quality issues and develop a plan to figure out how to address those, utilizing a whole bunch of different partners. And then in step 4, which we're right about doing right now, and in some ways we already are doing it, is implementing that water cleanup plan. Now, Clark County, a lot of what ecology was doing was kind of looking more at just looking at E. coli and fecal coliform in the streams and finding high spots and looking at the land use. But another thing that Clark County, our scientists, started doing was to also do this microbial identification and source tracking, which uses these fecal DNA markers to determine the sources. And so when they do that, basically our scientists will go out there, take samples, and they can send them to a lab that can match them to different animals. And so for a lot of these in the East Fork, we had a hunch that and we were gonna test for 4 different take it off and say, what you got? You have to, it's you pay for them, ask them. And so that's why we chose for
Hey, Eric,
yeah.
I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulties in hearing you. So,
Uh-oh.
so we can hear you now, but it's slowed down a lot.
Okay. Is it any better now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I hope that doesn't happen again. I didn't get any notification of that, but so yeah, we tested for human, dog, horse, and cow based on land use some of that analysis. And then Department of Ecology and Clark County helped to narrow it down to 4 focus areas. We have highlighted here Jenny Creek, McCormick Creek, Breezy Creek, and then Rock Creek North, that has some different issues. And then, as I had mentioned, we started to implement this source identification, and and I can talk about some of those results now. Most of these were sampled in 2020, and far and away, the primary sources were pointing to human and dog. And so what that means is probably failing septic systems, and also, dogs. So that can be from parks, but it can also be people just letting their dogs go out, not picking up in the yard, and maybe living by a stream, or in some cases, dog is often prevalent in more urbanized areas, which, as I mentioned, the East Fork Lewis is, that watershed is developing pretty quickly. So you get down closer to the center, and I think that's where we picked up a lot of dog. But we also identified some of the other large animals related to agriculture, namely horse. And so you can see the points there that are highlighted in orange is where horse was detected, and if you can see those little codes there, there's McCormick Creek. It was identified there, in Breezy Creek also, and then Rock Creek North as well. And I noticed that I want to mention that these samples were detected, and only once. So when they were detected, that means that they weren't quantified. So it was detected, but there wasn't a large enough number to also quantify it. And some of these other samples that we found, the other sources that we found, we were able to detect it and quantify it. And also that they were only detected one time. So they weren't confirmed. Now there's also kind of another little caveat there, that the fecal biomarker for DNA, doesn't really survive that well in the water column. And so it's likely found pretty close to the source. So it doesn't tell the entire story here. But we also did find cow in a couple of the tributaries. In Jenny Creek, there were multiple detections. And then in Breezy Creek, there was one quantifiable sample that was found for cow. So the cleanup plan, which is, I don't know if it's been finalized, but it's being developed, prioritizes helping people with septic systems. And you can do that with through a number of programs, through WSU Extension, or public health offers some guidance there. The small acreage agriculture, addressing that, helping folks with best management practices, stormwater management for some of the more urbanized areas or developing areas of the watershed, and then riparian reforestation, kind of addressing the temperature issue. And now we're starting to implement. So get a lot of support from partners like, as I mentioned, WSU Extension, the Conservation District, help folks with technical assistance, workshops on best management practices, and there's more to come there. So keep your eyes peeled on, Poop Smart Clark, because there's a lot going to be coming out from there in the near future. We also did something similar, and this is the only other watershed I'll mention today. In 2019, we did a watershed plan for Whipple Creek, which also found levels of fecal coliform that exceeded state levels. And so we did some detection there as well with that source microbial analysis. we found horse at one location, and that one location highlighted in orange there is right by Whipple Creek Regional Park, which is a common equestrian area. And then we found one area highlighted in blue that there was one quantifiable sample, and we just tested for ruminant for that one. So we're not entirely sure what the animal was specifically. And these were tested these were found in January of 2019, so during the wet season. Kind of surprisingly, this one up in the corner right by the fairgrounds did not receive any animal hits there, but that's what we've been finding. Now, kind of up next, coming up will be the Lacamas Creek watershed. Is one that's basically what I just kind of described there for the East Fork Lewis River is just starting right now in Lacamas Creek. And so we'll be looking for more on there. We've also have a TMDL for Salmon Creek. And so our scientists just kind of put together a report recently that they did that source analysis for the lower Salmon Creek. And so again, because lower Salmon Creek is so urbanized, not surprisingly, human, dog were the key culprits there. And so, yeah, that's just want to fill you in a little bit on how we know some of these issues and kind of leading up to why we need to address these, in these partnerships, working with the Conservation District, working with WSU Extension and our other partners in public health. So I just want to share that with you. And at this point, I think if there aren't any questions, then I can turn it over to Brent.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. Before we move on to Brent's presentation, I think we might have a couple questions worth asking, and then we can proceed, which to our attendees, please be sure to put any questions you have into the Q&A box, okay? Ashley, do you want to ask the first question?
Sure. Let me pull it up. Okay, so if human and dogs are the most significant findings, should we really even be worried about our livestock and do anything with them, or should we? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is important. That's a good question. That is important as well. We weren't. It's kind of tricky. We weren't able to test at all locations, and that's why I kind of put in that little caveat there, how that fecal DNA marker doesn't travel well. We do know that the fecal coliform and the E. coli levels are exceeding state standards. The tricky part about this source analysis is it's more difficult to really understand on a granular level where it's all coming from. So undoubtedly, livestock and some agricultural practices can be impacting this. And so I would say that now is not the time to just say, well, I think it's covered. It's also important to think about, the numbers too. I mean, we're finding more dog because, there are more dogs in Clark County. I mean, Clark County is home to over 110,000 dogs. So, so there's that. And then also the way that it's conveyed through the storm systems, particularly in urban areas, can cause some things. So kind of with those two caveats there, I wouldn't kind of think that it's something that shouldn't be addressed. It definitely still is. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that was great. Another question. In regards to the overall levels of pollution in the county, do you expect similar results in other watersheds?
Yes, I think, yes, I think that there probably will be some similar results in other watersheds. I think that for Lacamas, maybe, we'll see. I mean, it's hard to guess. I can only really say anecdotally, but I think that Lacamas will have some bacteria issues, particularly up in some of the mid to upper parts of that stream and the tributaries. But yeah, that remains to be seen. I think hopefully we got some things coming out in the next year or two.
Awesome. I think we have one more question and then we can probably move on. What is the best way to dispose of dog manure? I know it should not go in the compost.
Well, that's good. That's a good question, and a good knowing thing is that it shouldn't go in the compost. We honestly just say bag it, scoop it, bag it, and trash it. I know that the plastic bags do cause some wrinkles and get a bad rap, but at the end of the day, you don't want to be composting it because there are concerns about if your pile gets hot enough to break that down, and an animal that's eating meat as well is a lot different than an animal that's just eating grass and corn. So there's a difference in the composting style and process that you do for farm animals and dogs. And to be honest, it's the landfills are designed to handle this type of material. And so, you want to bag it and trash it is really just the best thing to do for it now.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. I was just going to say too, if you want to learn more about composting of different livestock, check out our other first presentation in this series with Elaine. And so, okay, with that, you can move on.
Okay, awesome. Brent, I will do a quick introduction for you while you bring up your presentation, okay? Okay, Brent Davis specializes in regulatory policy related to the protection and conservation of ecological resources. He joined the county as a biologist administering the wetland and habitat ordinances in 1999, became the program manager in 2013, and was designated the county's shoreline administrator in 2017. All right, Brent, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little more generally tonight, not focus specifically on manure and livestock, but definitely relates to that. I'm just going to go over a couple of things. I'm going to talk about the underlying policy that drives the regulations that I'm going to talk about. And this is all really comes back to land use regulation, and the reason that it's really relevant to what some of the farming practices is that there have been some growth management hearings board decisions and some court decisions that say that our particularly the critical areas ordinance regulations required under the Growth Management Act have to address in some fashion existing and new agricultural uses as a land use. So it's something that we're stuck having to deal with, and I'm just going to go over that a little bit. So I'm going to start talking about the policy, the major state and federal regulations, and just touch on the county's comprehensive plan, which is basically how the county is at a planning level is addressing those other requirements. And then I'm going to actually dig into the regulations themselves. I'm not going to get into really fine detail, just kind of go over them in generality. But I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk about the codes that apply, which are primarily our wetland and our habitat regulations, how they apply to existing and ongoing activities, how they apply to changes in activities within an existing agricultural footprint, and how they would apply to expansion or new activities. And then I'm also going to touch on the procedural aspects, the reviews and the permits that might be required depending on what you're doing. And then I'm also going to touch on the critical areas ordinance update that we're starting later this year. just to give some sense of where some changes in these regulations might be headed. So to dive into the policy, just a quick overview of the Growth Management Act, or at least the portions that are applicable to what we're talking about tonight. So the Growth Management Act requires planning and zoning designations for certain agricultural lands, and it gives cities and counties the authority to regulate agriculture as a land use. It requires designation and protection of critical areas, which include wetlands and fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. And in that designation and protection, we're required to give special consideration to the conservation and protection of anadromous fisheries. So that's, salmonids primarily. The cities and counties are required to include the best available science in developing our policies and development regulations that in order to protect the functions and values of those critical areas. So that basically means that that we need to work with the best scientific information that's available at the time when we're developing policy, whether it's at a planning level or it's actually at the regulatory level in terms of adopting code. And then the Growth Management Hearings Board has concluded that cities and counties cannot exempt existing and ongoing agriculture from critical area regulations outright. So that basically means we, because of the best available science requirement, we can't just say, you've been doing what you're doing, you're fine. Unfortunately, we're being told that we actually have to provide some framework for reconciling those existing activities with the best available science requirements. So another piece is the Shoreline Management Act. It's very specific, and I don't know if it applies to anyone that's with us tonight, but it applies to lands within 200 feet of the ordinary high water mark or within the flood hazard area of streams with a minimum annual flow of 20 cubic feet per second. And it also extends into what are called associated wetlands, which are basically any wetlands that are contiguous with that area. It includes agriculture as a shoreline use. So there are specific standards in the Shoreline Management Act for agriculture, but it does not apply to activities that are not considered development. So there's a specific definition of development in the Shoreline Management Act that has to do with making material changes to the landscape or constructing structures. So a lot of agricultural activities do not fall into that definition of development. It provides a simplified permitting pathway for specific agricultural activities. These are called shoreline exemptions. They're not exemptions from the act. They're exemptions from the requirement to get a permit. You actually are still required under these exemptions to get what's called a statement of exemption, which is technically like a permit, but it's a much more streamlined process. This primarily applies to construction of roads, placement of utilities, irrigation infrastructure, and or existing flood protection. So if you have dikes or levees, maintaining those or keeping those in operation. It also establishes setbacks from the ordinary high water mark, which is essentially the interface between the waterway and the land for structures specifically, and also approval criteria for specific uses. And it also requires the incorporation of the Growth Management Act critical areas. So the critical area regulations that apply countywide are also applied under the Shoreline Management Act. Another piece that's a little bit different, and again, I don't know if this applies to anyone here tonight, but the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. This is a federal regulation that is implemented through county code. It applies specifically to the federal designated scenic area, which is the southeastern part of the county. and it requires specific planning and zoning designations for agricultural land. So there's different zoning for agricultural lands in the gorge area than there is in the rest of the county. It establishes county review authority and detailed use criteria for new activities in designated agricultural lands. And most of those activities are actually conversions. You know, if you're going to build a structure, a house or something like that. But there are regulations in there. It allows the continued use of established agricultural lands in all designations except for open space without any review by the county. So open space, I think, primarily applies to the wildlife refuge. So, anyway, it basically allows ongoing activities within this specific regulation to continue without further regulation. And then it includes additional policies for wetlands and certain habitats and waterways that overlay the growth management critical area policies. So the important thing here is that this gorge scenic area is an overlay to the rest of the county code. It doesn't supersede it. So we have to apply both when we're in the scenic area, and whichever one has the more restrictive requirements is the standard that we apply. So that's, and then the last piece is the county comprehensive plan, which basically takes all these broader policies and puts them into framework of how the county is going to implement them. So it designates agricultural resource lands as required under the Growth Management Act. So these are lands zoned specifically for agricultural uses. Doesn't preclude agricultural activity outside of those lands, but it does restrict other types of development in those agricultural lands. It establishes an equestrian overlay with specific policies for equestrian uses. I really don't know a lot about that, but there is a specific overlay for that. And I know there's some ongoing work right now in terms of equestrian policy. I'm not involved with that specifically. It incorporates the Shoreline Master Program, which implements the Shoreline Management Act, and it establishes policies to meet the growth management critical area requirements. And then it also states that agricultural activities performed in accordance with county, state, and federal laws should not be considered public nuisances or be subject to legal action as public nuisances. So that's a specific provision that pertains to the county's essentially ability to act upon complaints from neighbors who may not like the agricultural practices. So it's not something that I deal with, but I just thought I'd mention it because it is specifically and explicitly in the county's comprehensive plan. So now to dive into the regulatory aspect itself. So to go over the applicable codes, this is Clark County Code Title 40, which is the county's development code. Chapter 40.440 is the Habitat Conservation Ordinance, which is designed to address the Growth Management Act requirement to designate and protect fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. And we do this primarily by relying on the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife priority habitats and species list. So those are the habitats that are defined in that list that are protected or conserved under our code. The ordinance includes performance standards for protecting existing functions and values of priority habitat and species, including avoidance and minimization thresholds. So if you're doing new activities, there are specific criteria you have to demonstrate you cannot avoid or minimize your impact. And then it includes compensatory mitigation measures for unavoidable impacts. It relies on assessment of site conditions and application of Department of Fish and Wildlife management recommendations by qualified professionals, generally either county biologists or professionals retained by the landowner. This ordinance was actually specifically crafted to provide for the county to do the bulk of the heavy lifting on the analysis to relieve landowners of the financial burden of having to hire experts. But it's always landowners' right to do so. And in more complicated projects, it's often in a landowner's best interest to do so, because the landowner or the applicant ultimately has the burden of proof to demonstrate that they're meeting the requirements of the code. And then the ordinance also provides specific exemptions and permitting pathways. And I'll get into some of that a little bit later. The next ordinance is the Wetland Protection Ordinance, which meets the GMA requirements to designate and protect wetlands. It provides criteria for designating wetlands and wetland buffers based on state and federal definitions. It includes performance standards for protecting existing functions and values of wetlands and wetland buffers. And like the habitat ordinance, it includes avoidance and minimization thresholds and compensatory mitigation measures. The wetland ordinance is a little bit more prescriptive than the habitat ordinance in terms of how we quantify impacts and what's required for mitigation. So it's a little bit more cut and dried and less tailored to specific site conditions. And then it relies on assessment of site conditions and application of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and ecology protocols, which generally need to be done by qualified professionals. Again, that can be county biologists or professionals retained by the landowner. And then it also provides specific exemptions and permitting pathways. The Shoreline Master Program, which is how we implement the Shoreline Management Act. It meets the requirements of the Shoreline Management Act, designates shoreline streams and lakes. So that 20 cubic feet per second criteria, it's already been determined in actually the legislation what streams and lakes meet that criteria. So those are specifically listed. It defines shoreline setbacks and use criteria for agriculture. It relies on determination of the ordinary high water mark by a qualified professional following a protocol provided by the Department of Ecology. It incorporates designation and protection standards for the GMA critical areas, the wetlands and habitat in particular. And it provides permitting pathways for regulated uses and developments. And this one also includes direct oversight by the Department of Ecology. So they basically have to approve our ordinances for this when we adopt it. And in addition to that, more complicated permits, which are called conditional use permits or variances, ecology is actually the decision maker. We submit a recommendation to them. And then there is a state hearings board that hears appeals to shoreline decisions. And then the last one I'm going to talk about is the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area. This implements the scenic area regulations. It overlays and does not replace the county code, as I mentioned before. It contains specific standards for allowed uses in agricultural designations. It has different definitions and additional standards for the growth management critical areas, and where there are conflicts, the most restrictive standards apply. It also provides for specific exemptions and permitting pathways, and appeals of decisions under the Gorge Code go to the Gorge Commission, which is a federal commission established by the National Scenic Area Act. So those are the codes. Let's talk about existing and ongoing agricultural activities. So outside shoreline areas, they're currently exempt outright in wetlands and wetland buffers. They're exempt in priority habitat and species areas except riparian habitat, and they're permitted outright in Columbia Gorge areas. Inside shoreline areas, existing agriculture is generally not considered development, so it's just not applicable under shoreline. So I'll talk a little bit about riparian habitat next. So there's two ways to approach compliance for existing and ongoing agriculture in riparian habitat that is located outside of shoreline areas. There's what's called the default option. This is a prescriptive set of standards based on the type of stream, and it essentially provides for an inner zone that's designated for habitat protection and restoration, and an outer zone that allows agricultural activities that don't further degrade existing habitat functions, which basically means your ongoing activities are going to be fine in that outer zone. These zones are quite a bit smaller than the zones that are regulated for development. So for instance, for fish-bearing streams, the inner zone is 50 feet under this default option, whereas we regulate 200 feet on a fish-bearing stream for development. There's also a option for a custom plan. In the code, it's called an agricultural habitat protection plan. And essentially, this is intended to allow landowners to apply appropriate best management practices following NRCS guidelines. There is some assistance available from the Conservation District in figuring out how to put together a plan. The county actually provides some funding for that. The code requires landowners that use this option to record an affidavit that certifies that they have a plan in place, but there's no county review of the plan, and there's no statutory requirement to even submit your plan to the county. In fact, there's a state law that suggests that the county cannot require you to submit your plan for county review. So for changes to agricultural activities within your existing footprint, outside the shoreline area, you're still exempt in wetlands and wetland buffers. That exemption is very broad and quite frankly doesn't comply with current growth management requirements. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. It's also exempt in priority habitat and species areas except riparian habitat, as long as you're maintaining existing habitat functions. So if you're not doing something new that creates more impact, you're still exempt. So new structures or removal of woody vegetation is likely to be regulated. And then in the gorge scenic area, changes to activities within your existing footprint is permitted outright in some of the management areas. There is an exception for new cultivation for more than a home garden, which includes lands that have been fallow for more than 5 years. And then inside shorelines, specific activities such as maintenance or construction of roads, structures, irrigation dishes or irrigation structures, flood hazard structures, or grading to improve drainage. These activities are regulated and likely to require some kind of shoreline review. And then inside riparian habitat, back to the default option I mentioned earlier, as long as those changes don't reduce existing habitat functions, they would, in the outer zone, they would be in compliance. And then, in terms of the custom plan option, any activity that complies with BMPs identified in the plan would be allowed. And you would also have the option to modify your plan as needed. So if you're going to undertake some new activity that wasn't covered in your existing plan, but there were BMPs that you could employ, you could modify your plan to accommodate those additional BMPs. For expansion and new activities, they're generally subject to the same standards and procedures as all other new development. And then in the shoreline area and the gorge area, there are specific use standards and approval criteria that could be applied. So essentially, takeaway for that is just if you're doing expansion or new activities, it's likely to be regulated under our critical areas ordinance and our shoreline code and potentially the gorge code. So in terms of procedures and permits, for wetlands and habitat, we have a process called a determination. This is something that can be done concurrently with a permit application or in advance as what we call a predetermination. This is essentially where we would send a biologist out to the site to evaluate what wetlands, wetland buffers, and priority habitats are on the site. This is something that a determination is optional unless you're actually needing to apply for some kind of development or something that requires a permit. Then we actually do require that determination. And in that process, we can review documents prepared by a consultant. We can respond to specific questions. Our determinations are generally binding on us for 3 years. So once we give you some information, you have a period of time which you can rely on that. In terms of permits, there's what's called a type 2 or type 3 process, or I'm sorry, a type 1 or type 2 process, which depends on the type and extent of impact. Type 1 process is a completely administrative review. Generally a 21-day timeline once your application is complete. Type 2 process requires public notice, has a 78-day review timeline, so it's a lot more involved. We do have currently what we call an expedited permit, which are for cases where something technically requires a permit. We don't have a legal way to exempt it, but we determine that it doesn't have any significant impact and doesn't require mitigation. So it has a reduced fee and allows us to issue a decision that covers the landowner, ensures that they're in compliance with the code. For shoreline areas, we do ordinary high water mark determination. It's required for most shoreline exemptions, and it's required for all shoreline permits. If we have a case where the location of the activity relative to a high water mark really doesn't factor into the decision in terms of trying to verify a setback or determine, how much impact there is and how much mitigation might be required, we can waive the high water mark determination. We also include wetland and habitat review as needed, but I'd note that all shoreline areas are priority habitat as well. So there's almost always a habitat review unless it's a specific case where we determine there's no habitat impact. Then we may waive that requirement. So more about shorelines, the statement of exemption. And as I mentioned before, this is not an exemption from the standards of the code, it's exemption from the permit process. It's a type 1 review. It may require wetland or habitat review, and it may include conditions of approval or require mitigation. The next level is a substantial development permit, which is a much bigger process, and it generally also triggers the State Environmental Policy Act, which is another layer of review and requires a notice to a range of public agencies and gives them an opportunity to comment. They usually require a wetland or habitat review, and they will include conditions and mitigation almost always. And then the conditional use and permits and variants, these are much more complicated, have some additional approval criteria other than the specific use criteria for the activity being proposed. And they generally, they do go to ecology for final approval. The gorge permits, there's an expedited review process for certain types of activity, and it's an accelerated type 2 process that still requires public comment, but it has a specific and shorter timeline. And then the standard review is the county's standard type 2 review process. There is a variance allowance but it only applies to numerical standards such as a buffer width or a setback or a structure height or something like that. And the process that's required, or procedure that's required for that, will depend on the amount of variance that's requested. So small variance could be a type 1 process administrative decision. A little bit bigger variance would require public notice, and a substantial variance would actually have to go to a hearings examiner. All the decisions under the gorge permit are sent to the Forest Service and the Gorge Commission. They don't have the ability to just alter the decision. If they have a problem with it, they actually have to file an appeal. So the last thing I'm going to touch on is wetland habitat code updates that are scheduled to be completed next year. We're going to be starting this hopefully in early August. We have changes that are required to meet current growth management standards for designating and protecting critical areas used for agriculture. So basically, our current codes were adopted in 2006, and there was early inklings at that point that we couldn't just exempt existing agriculture, but the case law that's in place now was not in place at that time. We did include riparian areas at that time, more because we were hoping to convince the National Fishery or NOAA Fisheries to give us a liability exemption under the Endangered Species Act. Anyway, so we're going to have to do a little bit more than we're currently doing in general for critical areas for existing agriculture. So what we're proposing, and this is falling in line with what the Department of Commerce recommends in their model code and their critical areas handbook. We're basically going to propose to exempt all existing and ongoing activities that are done in accordance with the best management practices in the latest NRCS Field Office Technical Guide. In addition to that, landowners will have the option to develop a farm plan similar to what's currently in place for riparian habitat, or to come to the county and get develop a stewardship plan that's specific to your site. If you come to the county, there will definitely be a fee for that. And then we're also going to replace the expedited permit for wetlands and habitat that I mentioned previously with a statement of exemption process. Again, that'll have a fee associated with it because we do operate on a cost recovery basis. But that statement of exemption will be an option for a landowner that wants written coverage to know that they're meeting the exemptions in the code. Or if there's some specific activity that doesn't meet any of the other exemptions, but doesn't appear to require mitigation, we will be able to cover that under a statement of exemption. So I know that was a lot, but that pretty much covers it. So I can take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Brett. I think we will have like a few questions, so I will go ahead and start those off. First question, what do you mean by inside shoreline versus outside shoreline?
Okay, so the shoreline management area pertains to specific water bodies that meet that 20 cubic feet per second annual average flow criteria, or lakes that exceed a certain size threshold. And those are designated by the state and adopted in the county's shoreline master program. So any land within 200 feet of the high water mark of those water bodies, or in the 100-year flood zone of those water bodies, or any wetlands that are contiguous with those areas, is considered the shoreline management area. So that is what we call the shoreline area. So if you're within that area, you're subject to the Shoreline Management Act. If you're not in that area, you're not subject to the Shoreline Management Act. And the standards for agriculture in particular are a little bit different. Actually, in shoreline, there's a little bit more flexibility, particularly for new or expanded agriculture than there is outside.
Thank you. So this is kind of like a case study question, I guess. I have a wetland that's kind of off of a major creek, and I run my cattle in the fields, and there's a permanent wetland as well as like the area that gets soggy throughout the year. What are the best practices, and what do I need to be making sure that I'm following in terms of the letter of the law?
Well, in terms of wetlands, the existing and ongoing activity is currently exempt from the county's wetland regulations. And the activities you're doing there would also not be subject to any state or federal wetland regulations at this time. As long as you're not changing how it's being used, and you're not bringing in material or trying to alter the drainage. Moving forward, under the code that's coming, where we're likely to end up is that you're going to need to look at those Natural Resource Conservation Service BMPs that are in the technical guide, and I'm not familiar with those off the top of my head. That's something that once we get into our new code, myself and my staff are going to have to get trained up on. Right now, we would rely on the conservation district to provide that kind of information. What I can tell you is that we don't really want to be in the business of regulating agricultural activities, but the state says we have to be. So right now, the way that our current regulations are operating is we're not out looking for people that aren't in compliance with the standards in terms of agricultural activities. We're generally catching up with folks if we get complaints from neighbors and we can clearly identify that there is something that isn't in compliance with the code. And then we're trying to be as hands-off as we can be in terms of helping people get into compliance. We're generally referring them to the conservation district to either formally or informally adopt some BMPs to try and meet the intent of the current code. And I don't foresee that changing in the future. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, so like at the conservation district, we often, because we're working with NRCS guidelines and those different BMPs, so we often talk about with riparian zones as well as wetlands to do exclusion fencing to keep your livestock out of it. So it's sounding like, if I'm correct, that moving forward, there is going to be some of that that's going to be into the code, correct?
Just in the general sense that if we can identify activities that are not meeting those BMPs, that those would not be in compliance with the code. Okay. Without some kind of mitigation or a permit from us to allow it.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Next one, if I want to report a manure problem, who should I contact?
Yeah, that's going to be a difficult one, at least from my side of things, because our regulations don't specifically regulate manure management unless perhaps it's being placed in a wetland or placed in a stream for disposal or as some kind of fill material. So I don't know if that's something that Eric could address, at least as far as from the county point of view. I think that the Department of Ecology, depending on the scale of that activity, might have an interest in that, particularly if it's putting a state waterway at risk. But aside from that, that's about all I can say about it.
Yeah, I know ecology, some people have referred to the ERTS reporting as well. So as a conservation district, we are non-regulatory, but if that's what you'd like to do, that's what I've heard. But okay, so there's a couple of questions about which streams. You mentioned the Shoreline Management Act streams, and that there was like kind of that threshold of how large. Could you give a couple of examples of some of the streams that fall into that? And are there, and then to follow up that after the examples, are there some streams that are too small for the Shoreline Management Act, but then are there other regulations for those?
Okay, so yeah, just some examples. So Salmon Creek is a shoreline stream well up into Vennersburg. Shoreline management area extends quite a ways up Talachi Creek, quite a ways up Cedar Creek, extends up Lacamas Creek quite a ways, and Fifth Plain Creek up to the point where it's confluence with Shanghai Creek. So those are some examples that off the top of my head. The lower portion of Whipple Creek is also included. I believe might be up to Packard Creek. You can actually go to the county maps online, and the environmental, there's an environmental map, and if you dig around in there, the shoreline areas should be one of the layers that you can bring up. So in terms of smaller streams, yeah, that's riparian habitat would apply to streams, even seasonal streams. Generally, what we look for a seasonal stream is a clearly defined channel where we can see there's actual erosion. It's got enough energy and velocity when it's flowing to keep it from vegetating. That's at least 6 inches wide. And so what we regulate on those streams, or between those seasonal streams and what would be a shoreline stream, currently is vegetation clearing only in that riparian area. So anything that causes the removal of vegetation would be something that we would regulate. Moving forward, we're also going to include grading as well as in-stream work. So yeah, that's how we deal with streams.
Awesome. Okay, one final question for you, Brent. Can you keep livestock inside of the shoreline? Can you let livestock drink from streams as long as they are small?
Well, yeah, I mean, inside the shoreline, if you have existing grazing land, there's no requirement to do anything differently than what you're doing. If you wanted to convert, a shoreline that is not being used for agriculture to an agricultural use, there would be regulations for that. I don't, off the top of my head, know what those, all those use standards are. But it seems to me, I mean, it's a reasonable thing to provide access for livestock for watering purposes. So I'd have to look specifically at the code to be able to answer that question completely. So if I can get an email address, I could probably respond to that more thoroughly.
Perfect. Sounds good. All right. Well, I think we will call it a night. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you, Terry, for joining us for the past 3 weeks and speaking on the small acreage program. And thank you both to Eric and Brent for joining us and giving a great presentation this evening. If you missed any of our other presentations during this Manure Matters series, you can find them on our website. And also don't forget to sign up for a Tarp Your Manure site visit and fill out our survey after this is over. So thank you guys and have a good night.